Hello, everyone. May I kindly ask you to come back? We'll start soon.
Klikker. Hij doet het weer, dus dat is echt top.
En dan hebben we onze slides van.
Ja, die hebben we daar al.
Interessante nieuwe spreker.
Ja, maar Mr. Zomerplaat is toch dan nog.
Ja, mooi. Ja, je moet af en toe een beetje zelf laten.
Ik merk het bijna dus met het zo.
Ja, zeker. Ja, zat je helemaal aan het denken.
Ik ga het met collega's.
Ja,
Die ernaast staat.
oké. Ja.
Weg meteen voor je timer.
Oh ja.
Ja, ik heb al gezegd. 10, 11.
Ja, het is wel rustig. Dus dat is goed.
Ja.
Nee, ik dacht namelijk als het echt zo vol weet je wel.
Oh, dat het dan.
Ja, dat
het wordt drukker, want mensen komen voor de inaugurele later.
Ja, precies. Ja, nee, ik snap het. Hey, wat hey. Hoi, Casper.
Goed je te zien.
Aangenaam.
Welkom. Ja.
Dankjewel.
Fijn dat je er bent.
Dankjewel. En
Voor in Heerlen, hè? Patrick?
Oh, serieus?
Dat wist ik ook niet.
En daarna?
Daarna scherp veel opgegroeid.
Oh, oké.
20 jaar lang. Nog vlakbij.
Ja. En niet terug. Ja, heel mooi. Ja,
Oh, nest.
ja precies. Wat fijn.
En jullie gaan beginnen, hè?
Ja.
Nou, dat zien.
Ik ook.
Ik zei tegen Patrick, wij zijn de eerste die wat concreet gaan presenteren.
Dat wel, ja. Dat is ook extreem recent in elkaar gezet.
Ja.
Dus ik
Ik zag er nog heel pas in de presentatie op een aanpassen.
ja, dat echt tijdens een
Ik had Patrick nog niet in het echt ontmoet. Toen dacht ik, nou, ik wil wel een beetje goede sier maken, maar ik zat nog met de slides in elkaar te
Ja, maar
plaatsen.
het is allemaal mijn schuld. Hij had heel erg netjes voorbereid. Ik was heel erg laat met alles. Ik zat helemaal vol.
Ja, maar goeie. Ja, ik maak het niet. Moet je niet vragen.
Ja, dankjewel. Ja, goed.
All right, everybody. If you can please take a seat.
Oh, gaat het zo? Kan ik hier staan? Ja, dat is beter.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. We're now going to commence with a part where we will focus on examples of the new social contract formation on various levels. My name is Ceren Pekdimir. I work as an assistant professor at the Maastricht Sustainability Institute, and I'm happy to chair this particular session where we're going from the local up until the intergovernmental. So I'm very excited about what we will hear. We have a very ambitious program. Within 1 hour and 15 minutes or so, we will have to go through 7 presentations. So I hope you're set and ready to absorb everything. I know I am. And without further ado, I would like to ask on stage Job Zomerplaag and Casper Gelderblom, who will talk about building a natural social contract for the Heerlen community.
Well, glad to see everyone today here. My name is Job Zomerplaag. I'm a PhD researcher at Studio Europa, Maastricht University, and United Nations University Merit.
My name is Casper Gelderblom. I'm an alderman in the municipality of Heerlen, which is about 20 minutes east from Maastricht. And I used to be, until very recently, and kind of still am, a PhD researcher at the European University Institute in Florence.
Yeah, we're very glad to have you all here together, and we'd like to talk about social contracts, but also what it could bring in terms of collective action. We're bringing a concrete case from Heerlen. And we're talking about energy poverty, and we had been discussing this topic already a bit earlier today. If we talk about energy poverty, it's about energy crisis to an energy transition, and energy poverty to energy justice, and maybe also social contract to collective action. And we're going to discuss with you today how that looks like. Sustainable, affordable, and fair energy supply is something that we all long for and we think is very important, but it's not a reality for hundreds and thousands of people in the Netherlands and Europe and beyond. People live in poor insulated homes and do not have sufficient income to actually also invest in sustainability measures that would actually lower their electricity bill. So we're faced with a huge problem and we need to find solutions for that. And the success of the energy transition therefore depends on social acceptance, but also participation of people, and that they understand that they're part of this transition and that they can also keep up. So we're facing not only an energy crisis, but maybe also a social crisis and an ecological crisis, a confidence crisis. A lot of things come together. And the term of energy poverty is a nice term because it kind of allows us to express the global urgency of the matter, but doesn't really provide local solutions, right? And I believe, and we believe, that it's a tricky concept because of three reasons. First of all, because it risks to fragmentize small local efforts, so we're all doing our thing, but we're not really thinking about a concerted, orchestrated effort there. It's quite narrowly scoped. It overlooks maybe public health issues. It maybe overlooks built environment questions we have. But also, if we want to think about solutions to a global crisis, it seems quite far away if you think about it locally. So what we argue is that it's an insufficient framework for collective action, energy poverty.
Yeah, and so let me quickly walk you through the case that we'll be discussing today, which is Heerlen, the municipality that I kind of represent these days. It's good to say that I've only been a deputy mayor for 6 months, so I'm still kind of transitioning from the code and the world that you're all in to the one that I currently find myself in. And that world in many ways is a grim one, to be frank, because at this moment, according to the most recent statistics in the Netherlands, we have a share of energy poverty in households overall of 6.88%. In the broader former mining region of Parkstad, that's 8.44, and in Heerlen, which is the central municipality in that region, it's 12.35. So it's almost double the national average. And behind that reality, behind that statistic rather, is a very grim reality. People who really had to choose between heating or eating in recent months. Fortunately, there were some measures taken at the national level and ultimately also the local level, and we'll come to talk about that alleviated the situation. But quite clearly, it exposed structural issues in the way that we've arranged our energy provision. And in relation to that, also how social structures and social injustice interacts with that systemic problem of energy provision. Interesting to mention as well is that there's a very... can you go one back? Yeah. Thank you. So the overall number, if you look at the table at the top, is the one I just mentioned, and then on the right you find all the districts in Heerlen. There's 21 of them, and as you can kind of make out by the dark red, an overwhelming majority of the districts has not just energy poverty statistics above the national average, but actually double or even triple those numbers, with Molenberg district and Vrijheide de Stak being the all-time high. With hovering around 20%. So those are very serious numbers. Just to kind of frame the issue of energy poverty in the Netherlands a little bit further is the figure on the left, where you see that it's in Dutch, but 75% of households in energy poverty are in housing cooperatives. So it gives you some sense of where the pain is really located. And so what we did in response to this crisis that we already saw forming in the summer when commodity prices were going up in the energy sector was to form what we call in Dutch the Verbond voor Energierechtvaardigheid, which translates roughly to Energy Justice Compact. And you can see the logo here. And what we did concretely is that we took all the municipalities in the former mining region, lumped them together and brought them together with the housing cooperatives in the region, with education institutions, with healthcare institutions, with charity institutions. And we all said, the kind of budding crisis that we see happening right now, we already saw that a few months from that point onwards, this is all in July that this first started to take shape, loads of households won't anymore be able to pay their bills. And as I said just before, they'll be faced with the choice between heating or eating. So we have to take initiative, but none of us individually, even though we all have a stake and all have a responsibility, none of us individually can really take on this challenge. So we have to bind together. And the crucial invention I think that we came up with here is a discursive one. So if you go to the next one. And the discursive one is that we shifted the focus from energy poverty as the key concept here to energy justice. And that seems perhaps at first glance just a semantic shift, but I think it's a more significant one. That's what we'll be talking about. There are three very simple guiding principles behind the notion of energy justice as opposed to energy poverty. First of all, affordable energy, very bread and butter. Right? That's what households first noticed when the energy crisis took off, that their energy bills were no longer affordable. Secondly, and equally simply, a livable living room temperature. And thirdly, and quite crucially, but kind of for a lot of people not the first order of business, order of concern, sustainable ecological footprint. And in the energy crisis and in the questions that around, I think, the roots of the energy crisis, we find these three things, I think, as roughly equally important. And so these were not only the guiding principles for my fellow policymakers in the region or for the organizations that joined the compact, but they were also key. Let me see how I framed it here. They also created the necessary conditions for a conception of justice, which is to say, if either of these three guiding principles are not met in the current condition, which they quite clearly for many, many people are not, then we can describe the situation as unjust. And that shifts our focus and our understanding of the crisis that we're going through away from a matter of poverty alleviation, which has something neutral about it, right? That we can observe a socioeconomic phenomenon of poverty as something that's out there, to a question of justice. And in doing so, you cast the situation as unjust, which therefore makes it a moral issue rather than just a socioeconomic challenge, and making something a moral issue also has political implications. So it brought us into, I would say, a mode of activity that if we had just approached it as one of poverty, wouldn't have been the case equally strongly. Just to describe briefly, and then I'll go back, if you don't mind, Job, afterwards, just to describe very briefly what we've done so far. So we launched the compact in October with all the organizations that I just described. I think at this point we total about 30 organizations with a massive reach in terms of just their impact on the built environment, their reach into communities, especially vulnerable communities. We did a number of things. We found national subsidies to create emergency isolation budgets for the target group, which is about 20,000 people that are most vulnerable at the moment in the whole region. And we provided them with the offer of using 250 euros directly to improve isolation in their homes to get through the summer. So far we've reached 10,000, sorry, not people, actually households. And so that's 50% of the target group since mid-October. We've also recruited and then trained a very diverse group of energy savings coaches who engage in personal assistance to the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable to help them actually implement the emergency isolation measures. And with that, we've reached about 4,000 people, which is 20% of the target group. Finally, a very concrete example, and I see a representative of the municipality here was also instrumental in realizing this change. In one of the neighborhoods, the districts I just mentioned, Vrijheide, among the hardest hit, not just here, not just in Heerlen, not just in the region, not just in the province, but nationwide. There was almost no housing cooperative ownership in that district, which is very unusual, because usually you see a correlation between housing cooperative ownership and poverty rates. We, I think, made a transformative step there by purchasing, or assisting rather, the housing cooperatives in purchasing 50 very low label, mostly G label, energy label houses, and then use their renovation through subsidies as a municipality as a kind of flywheel to get the renovation going in this very vulnerable area, inner city, which ultimately is projected to reach over 300 houses out of a total in the district of 850. So it's a very concrete example of the collaboration that came from this Energy Justice Compact.
Yeah,
so
you want to go
for it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
My research is situated as well in Vrijheide community and also see how this plays out. But can we really speak about social contract formation if we listen to what Caspar and colleagues have been working on? I think to some degree, yes. But this is maybe a discussion we can also have together over a drink or maybe later on today. But and why so? Well, first of all, you see that there is an emergence of a new alliance between civil society, market and government, as was presented before. There's certainly a promise of providing justice and security to everyone involved, and especially to most vulnerable groups in the energy justice question. But because of this thematic focus on energy, we can also include and exclude quite quickly and quite efficiently who should be concerned, which places should be included. It kind of allows for demarcation. And it has an aim to address 3 interrelated crises, which is also the core of Patrick Hunch's work, the person that brought us all together today. Questions of ecological crisis, but also trust in governments, right? And also inequality. But if it is to be a social contract situation, can it actually generate also collective action frames?
Yeah, so if there's any sociologists among you, you'll be familiar with the term collective action frame. What it basically describes is a definition of a particular situation that then generates modes of collective action, right? So how do subjects understand themselves as a collective, and then from that understanding of themselves as a collective, move through collective action? Our thesis here would be, I think, that energy justice is an empowering frame because it shifts our focus from alleviation to the pursuit of justice, which is a more empowering mode as a subject to be in. And in doing so, by the link with energy specifically, and therefore the way that we've arranged energy provision, it kind of suggests that there has to be some kind of arrangement or categorization and contradistinction between impediments to that justice and catalysts for the delivery of energy justice. And so that opens the way, just by discursively presenting the situation in this way, for a system critique of the way that we've currently arranged, energy market relations, for example, and therefore also encourages us to think about how we might transform systemically the current arrangement of power relations.
And bear with us, I mean, this is still an emerging research topic. We have seen this morning that the social contract is very interesting to discuss more in global terms and maybe as a theory. But if we were to look into concrete local examples, can we really speak of social contract formation? This comes with several questions, but not questions I only want to ask fellow researchers or myself, and that will be part of my core research, but also you. If you work in policy, if you consider yourself an activist, these are all questions for you to consider. These are questions about multi-level dynamics. We see a lot of social contract formations happening at different levels. How do they interact? How do they obstruct each other? But also questions from protection to provision. If I listen to what's happening in Heerlen at the moment, there's a lot of focus on protection still, but can we really go to provision? Can we maybe incentivize social innovation, local energy cooperatives? That would be a next step to take. Commitment and solidarity. What binds these actors, and maybe also beyond the crisis? A crisis creates an action point, a window of action, but how can you also make this a long-lasting coalition? Other questions are about citizenship. What are the underlying assumptions about who we are, and what is a citizen in this whole new social contract emerging? Intermediation, renegotiation, there are different roles. I'm personally very much interested in the role of social workers, which might be at like a crossroads of a lot of different crises and questions happening in society, especially locally. And also the roles of researchers, right? If we want to study local social contract formation, are we only observing, or can we also be part of the change? And that's also something that Casper and I will be very interested in following, and also maybe doing our own contribution. And in conclusion, the question is, how can we come from a social contract to also collective action? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe we have room to take one question and then we move forward, and if we want, we can take more questions later on. Is there directly a question someone wants to pose here in the audience? Yes, please.
Yes, a question about the neighborhood here. I work there myself, and I know that the distrust in local government is enormous.
Yeah.
So if you want to work on a new social contract, how are you going to make that distrust change into trust? Maybe this is too big, but...
If you can repeat the question.
Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so the question for those watching at home is asked by someone who actually is working in the district, so I'd be pleased to make your acquaintance later, but is how can we, given the fact that there's a lot of distrust at the moment in local government in this particular district, how can we use perhaps this opportunity to mend that situation and to build trust again? I would say that that's one of the main reasons that we went for this very broad compact and this broad composition of organizations, because we do know that, for example, at least in some cases, and this really varies, there's more trust in the housing cooperative that you can actually speak to. There might be more trust in the social services that are not directly local government associated. There might be more trust even in charity organizations. And so that's why we brought together all these forces, because it gives you a kind of variability in the way that you present yourself, even though you're all part of the same umbrella constellation. Which, first of all, allows you to actually get behind that front door and tell the story of how we might actually help with the very same aid package, in a way, but presented by a different face. So that's the first step, to actually get past that front door. And secondly, if you are there and you can actually make the change, as we've now started to do with this intervention that I spoke about in Vrijheide, by purchasing these houses and then renovating others, hopefully, once you've gotten past the front door and you've actually made a positive change, you can also come out as saying, actually, we're working together with the local government and they've helped this, they've helped make this possible. So I guess that's the implicit hope in the way we've approached the whole compact in general.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I'm sure that later we can come back to you as well with further questions. All right, now let's move on from the local to the subnational level, where we look at an area-specific natural social contract for sustainable agriculture. And I would like to ask one of the speakers, both speakers, IJsbrand Snoei and Johan de Kleuver, to the stage.
It's only me, only Johan, but with his heart, he is with us. Thank you, Patrick, for inviting us to tell something about a beautiful cooperation in the Achterhoek, also a beautiful part of the Netherlands. In the Achterhoek, I work with farmers and with public and private organization on sustainable agriculture and sustainable countryside, let's say, and the marker model is, let's say, a kind of a governance model, a dialogue model on working on this sustainable goals. And I'm very glad to tell you something about it in this short time. What you see here, last year, 2022. You probably know that there was a lot of trouble on the road with agriculture and tractors and so on. There was a lot of protest. Why was this protest there? And the discussion went about nitrate. We have a nitrate problem in the Netherlands. There's too much nitrate emission. But listening to the farmers, and I was sitting in this debate the 5th of August with Remkes. I sat 4 hours next to Mark Rutte and exchanged our emotions with the farmers and the farmers groups. And when you listen to the farmers, it's not only going about nitrate. It was also going about families and families' tradition and about the feeling. No one is listening. About the feeling there's always top-down policy and not bottom-up. There is no good dialogue with each other. So I think that's one of the examples that the marker model grow, its birth. It was 4 years ago. It went on. It's a farmers' initiative, and it's about listening. It's about dialogue with each other. It's about working on sustainable goals, but give space, give room also to the farmers to make their own improvements. So I can click myself. What you see here is we made some governance bodies. One of the bodies is the Markenraad. It's not called to Mark Rutte. It's the Market Council. And in the Market Council, there are 2 public and 2 private bodies. The province of Gelderland, the regional water agency, Rabobank, and Friesland Campina. So we are working with dairy farmers in that part, with 35 dairy farmers. and together they formed the Mark Council. They set the goals. In our process planning, we said, show us the goals. That's also what I hear often from farmers. Set us goals. What's that point on the horizon? In my discussions for 10 years, it's always going about, give this spot on the horizon. Where should we go? They set the goals, regional. And the farmers, they listen, they accept. Other side. They set the goals on air, on land, on water, and the farmers, together they form a council, and they received those goals. And they said, okay, we're going to think about these goals, and where is our opportunity to work on these goals. And this common performance of the farmers, they presented it back again to the Market Council in 2 dialogues, in November last year and in December last year. And we had beautiful discussions with each other, with a lot of respect also to each other. Everyone accepted the goals, but when goals were too hard, they were set a little bit lower, so there was good discussion also about it, and a lot of room, space for the farmers to make their own improvements on their companies. And this deal dialogue we made in the 9th of December, you can see it's a kind of a agricultural agreement, a kind of a contract, a kind of a social contract we had with each other. Do we have a deal with each other? Are we going to work together the next years? We used the transition flower model of Patrick and applied it on our marker model. And there were a lot of items, but there are a few I pick up. And one is in the informal institutions. It's about reciprocity and system transparency. You see, one of the farmers said, here on this part, I am listened at. Someone is listening, and I'm saying something of what I want, and others say it. And there's a kind of transparency in how we go along with each other, so we know what goals we have. On an informal institution, on the formal institution level, we have bodies. We created our own bodies, so we have not only the province of Gelderland, not only the water management body. We created our own influence body, and it's called the Markeraad. But also the farmers, they created their own council. So 6 of the farmers on the themes land, water, and air, they represent the farmers in the Achterhoek in the discussion with the Markeraad. So we have kind of created a new governance bodies. That's the formal part. And they interact with each other. And there is, when you look in the eyes of the people, there is a kind of level of understanding with each other. It's not about, I set the goals and you have to meet that goals. No, it's listening to each other, but also giving space to each other. And kind of, when you do that, I do that. So it's more a kind of a contract, understanding, talking with each other, and on that level, on that social dimension level, you could say there's a kind of a mutual understanding. But it's not only about dialogue; it's also about reaching goals. So, and we developed a rewarding system in which the farmers who carrying out all kind of measurements to reach the goals, and they are rewarded for the measurements they make. And on that level, on the economic dimension and the ecological dimension, you see that applying this transition flower, that's one of the key success factors, I think, in the market model. It's too hard to read. It's in fact not to read, or you can read it in the handout. But I want to pick out some items from this model. One is we are working on 10 critical performance indicators. So on land, water, and air, like reducing carbon emission, like working on water quality, like working on restoring biodiversity. So we set 10 of them. You see it on the left side. We set targets for 2030. So concrete targets from the market, from public bodies for 2030. So we set them together. We made a kind of a reward system for the farmers. So farmers are on a certain level in reaching those goals. And for measurements they are carrying out on their own companies, they can earn points, reward points. And we have a separate budget to reward those farmers in carrying out those measurements. And every year, their reward point, they have to improve it, because it's less from value than the former year. So every farmer is stimulated to make the next step to the next year. And so that's the points. And when they carry out the measurements on their companies, they get paid for that measurement. And that's one of the points I discussed a lot with national and regional organizations about this earning models of the farmer, because we think that the farmer is part of the solution. We are convinced that the farmer is part of the solution. But you have to, it has to be part of this economic model of the farmer, because when we don't reward farmers for the measurements they do, why should a farmer do? So use their entrepreneurship to improve. Weight factor, we have different areas in the Achterhoek, and in the one area is different than the other area. So you can play with the weight factor. In the one area, it's water quality is more important than another area. So that's also part of the model. We have an average score already, so we set up the scores of the companies, of the dairy farms, and we compare them with the average scores of the last years. So you can see where they are now in the model. And when you come to the system transferee, it's an integral model. It's not only going about nitrate or biodiversity or water quality. It combines all the indicators together. It's compact, so it's not a difficult model, and it builds on former models that dairy farmers are working with already. It's understandable, so we made it together with the farmers, and they like to work with it. It's action-oriented, so it's not about only talking, it's about doing what I'm going to do this year, next year, to improve my scores. It's regional, so it's not on a local, it's a kind of a subnational level. So don't make it too big, but also don't make it too small. But think big, but start small. So when you start small, it's in your own area, in your backyard, and you can discuss with each other. It's much more better. Rewarding, so what you do is what you give, is you receive also something. So it's fair, So one of the points the farmers say to each other, it's not only about me. I hear a lot of that people say, what's in for me? So, but here they say, what's in for us? So how can we share our common interests, our farms, but also our sustainability goals? How can combine we that in our region? And it's horizontal, so it's not top down, a little bit, of course, but it's also horizontal. So we have goals, but top down, but we have also ideas, bottom up, and we dialogue with each other in a horizontal level. And then that's important, restore trust. Click too fast. Restore trust, that was the one conclusion in Remkes 5 August last year. There is no trust between government and farmers. And here we are working on restoring trust with each other. So I think that's the conclusion of this model. So yeah. Here there was a short movie, but it's not working. But what this farmer is saying, that the process, I find it very encouraging. You're doing something as a farmer. He looks to points in his farm he had never looked at. And figures in his farm are more living figures, and he knows what to do, how to improve them. You had input. I was heard at. Something was listening. So he doesn't need his tractor on his farm, but not to protest. He can discuss. He can call people. You can talk with each other. It looks quite simple, but it's not so easy. But they did it here in this way. And you can work towards that because you have thought about yourself. And I think I'm going to close with one remark I learned from a professor, Gert van Dijk. And he says, farmers' practice is the flower of science. And I think, the transition flower here, a lot of farmers I experience, they are willing to change. So, but you have to build on new governance and trust models on a regional level to get together to work on reaching goals with each other. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very nice example, and I think you at the end also answered one of my questions that I wrote down, what would happen if we wouldn't have such a social contract? So I think you already answered that. Thank you so much. I think we will wait with questions so we can make sure that everyone can present. So we hopefully come back to you later. I would now like to move on to a national level where we have Pedro Cisterna contribution online. Yeah.
So, well, I'm from Chile, and I'm based in Edinburgh. I'm doing my PhD law here, and I'm a executive director of NAVE, Nuestra América Verde. So I will give a brief analysis of what we lived in Chile in this recent constitutional process that we had. So I will just highlight some ecological approaches that were discussing there, and then I will propose some lessons from what we lived. So basically, after massive protest in 2019 against the government, spurred mainly by the severe inequality of the country, Chilean political parties agreed to reform the 1980 constitution that was made by Pinochet during the dictatorship. And then there was a referendum on this eventual constitutional process, and the majority of Chilean, 80% of the Chilean, vote for having a new constitution in Chile. And they decided to, the Chilean people decided that this constitutional process should be led by constitutional assembly. A constitutional convention was the organ that so 155 elected representatives, popularly elected representatives. So it was a very democratic process in that sense. But what is interesting is that since the beginning of the process, there was a very concern about the importance of having ecological approaches, not only in the product and in the constitutional draft, but also in how the discussion was framed. So in the procedural rules of the discussion and how this convention was working. In this sense, one of the first actions that the Constitutional Convention made was this a declaration of an climate emergency, and also and this basically served for highlight the situation that we live globally. At the same time, there were some procedural rules that highlighted the importance of having an ecological approach and to be coherent and responsible with the climate and the nature. So what these procedural rules of the convention frame was this idea to have a discussion, but also but always with a view of having the environment and the ecological protection on the top of the table. Obviously, this approach had an impact during the substantive discussion of the constitutional draft, and here maybe I will be quite legalistic with the discussion, but I would like to highlight a couple of rules that basically illustrate how this process tried to convene a new eco-social contract in Chile. And chapter 3 of the constitutional draft that was presented, the constitutional project, had rules on nature and environment. And these provisions basically reflect meaningful progress in recognizing the need to tackle climate crises and defend biodiversity. For example, Articles 127 of the constitutional project recognizes the rights of nature, and it states that the government and society have the duty to protect and respect nature, and also obliged the state to adopt an ecologically responsible administration. So basically, having all the time this ecological frame and behind any decision, any state decision, any public decision. But obviously, this had critiques amongst the Chilean public and the Chilean politicians that argue that basically this can block development in some way, this kind of rules. And basically another essential or vital rule of this constitutional draft that represent this ecological perspective was in Article 129. And here this article mandated the state to adopt prevention, adaptation, and mitigation measures to tackle the risk and vulnerabilities produced by the climate and ecological crisis. So this rule marks a substantive progress in shaping ecological institution and a climate conscious state. And even when it's not the first constitution expressly referring to climate change, it was the first constitutional project that referred or to use the term climate crisis. And also it highlighted the relevance of international cooperation in facing climate change. and it recognized how vital it is to continue complying with climate international treaties and instruments. So if we analyze this project, we can find like a huge progress from a developing country in adopting an ecological perspective to protect nature and biodiversity. So the question is, why this project was rejected? We had a referendum for approving or rejecting this constitutional project, and was rejected by 63% of the Chilean people, which is a huge percentage of rejection. It was very surprised, and it wasn't, but at the same time, it was part of a global rejection in terms of there is political elements, but also some practicalities that I think I would like to highlight. So I will focus on some lessons that we can take from this process that we are that we have. As a context, now Chile is starting a new constitutional process, which it's with an expert commission and only 50 popularly elected members of the public. So it's much smaller in terms of democratic sense, but hopefully it will have success. But the lessons of the previous process, I think there are four basically. First, it is important in this kind of process where there are plenty of discussions and complex discussions to a constant involvement of citizens. Sometimes the discussions were even when those who were popularly elected, they started to get some distance from the public and having like a close scenario of discussions, and the public basically delegate without any accountability the responsibility to draft the constitution in those representatives. And I think and this distance obviously created some miscommunication at some point, and plenty of the articles and rules that were proposed by the constitutional project were quite strange for the people, and considering that most of them are very complex, it was very complex as well to explain them, to explain the public to what was their importance and their vitality for constructing our future democracy. So that's a point that it relates to another lesson, which is basically facilitate the climate and environmental understanding, and also other matters, but because there are plenty of environmental and climate clauses that are complex to understand. For example, rights of nature, why the nature will have, like I was present in some discussions where the people asked why the nature can have rights, like what is the sense of that? So obviously, to make a political campaign for approving a project with that kind of discussions is difficult. So it's the actuality sometimes to discuss these things without having a real involvement of the citizens in this process. So make the rules more tangible also can help. Obviously, prevent fake news. The complexity of the rules and the quantity as well open the door for plenty of fake news spreading in social media, especially from the far right wing. So that is definitely a lesson that that we need to prevent for the next process. And I think it's part of a global phenomenon that we are having right now. And finally, some of the discussions illustrated stark positions regarding some issues, like, for example, water rights, property rights. And I think one of the lessons is that for the people, it was very important to see also agreements. And what we had was not only disagreements, but many of these agreements in terms of positions regarding what will be the best constitutional project. So I think try to find broader political agreements in drafting the constitution. It's something essential for having and for assure a success in a referendum for approving or rejecting a draft. And I think those elements are part of the lessons that we had from this process, and we hope that the new Chilean constitutional process will achieve success. But at the same time, recognizing all these discussions that we had in the previous one. That's one. Those are the things that I wanted to highlight with you and to present, because I think it is important not only for Chile, but especially for developing countries that are trying to get up in terms of climate ambition, ecological protection, environmental protection, in new social contracts that we are having in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. So thank you so much, and happy to receive questions.
All right, thank you, Pedro. Maybe it would be wise to immediately move on to Alina Saba, and if we have then questions for the national cases, then if you don't mind, Pedro, we can take questions for you as well, if it comes to that, after Alina Saba's presentation. Alina, I see that you're there as well. Hi.
Hello, yes.
Can you, I don't know if you want to,
Hello,
yes,
everyone.
perfect. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Alina from Center for Economic and Social Rights. Thank you for this opportunity. Today, I want to talk about the national case of Nepal. When we talk about the new eco-social contract or establishing an eco-social contract, I would like to give a national example of what does that mean for the marginalized and indigenous community that are who are trying to navigate the political and cultural and social space for establishing eco-social contract in a very new political opportunity. For example, in Nepal, let me share the screen. To talk about Nepal, so Nepal went through a massive political reforms in 2006, overthrowing the monarchy and Hindu kingdom and having and reestablishing the Federal Republic of Nepal. And what does, in that scenario, I would like to talk about what does it mean for talking about eco-social contract, and my argument is the political opportunity gives ample space for marginalized group, indigenous people, women's movement to build the eco-social contract. But is that space enough? And it is not enough. There are challenges, and it is not always the political movements that creates a space for establishing the social contract, be it in party politics or in legal instruments, mainly the constitution, but the movement of civil society in the form of a women's movement, Dalit rights movement, or minority rights movement, and especially more importantly, in the environmental and climate change movement. These are the new avenues other than the political spaces where marginalized group and indigenous people can establish the eco-social contract. So these are some of my main broader argument today that I will be sharing with this short presentation and evidence by some of the key examples. So Nepal went through some major political changes emerging from civil conflict in 2006. And it sought for regime change and structural changes, mostly by the social movements, calling it going towards a federal republic from a very centralized unitary kingdom like Hindu kingdom. And one of the main demand from social movement was recognition that social inclusion is one of the root cause of the conflict and discrimination and inequality. And they saw the new constitution drafting process that lasted from 2007 to 2015 as an opportunity to readdress this historical marginalization. And some of the key achievements that we were able to achieve, the social movements were able to achieve, were like constitutionally, legally, we're recognizing social justice as a legal concept for the first time in the history. And some of the principle of proportional representation for marginalized group, indigenous group, in terms of to participate in civil service, public spaces, or also the including the election. And further establishment of institutions such as National Inclusion Commission, Commission of Women, Dalit Commission for Dalit, Indigenous Nationalities, Muslims, among others, and introduction of proportional electoral system in federal and provincial parliaments. So, is this journey without challenges? How does the status quo react when we are talking about establishing a social contract that talking about addressing the cohesion conflict in the society and bringing in the cohesion in the political opportunity that new space has opened up? Is it easier? Definitely not, because then the society will move towards, when marginalized groups are talking about their rights, then it becomes highly polarized in terms of status quo versus the minority groups. So the adoption of constitution in Nepal went through two constitution election process in 2008 and 2011. The drafting process was rife with violent conflict, peaceful conflict, youth demonstration by social movements. And leading up to its adoption in week of September 2015, 40 people died, especially by the brutal police and security force shooting at them, whilst the center, capital Kathmandu, and mostly the urban elite groups were celebrating it as like one of the most inclusive constitution in the world and blah, blah, blah. And does the constitution or constitution making process always gives a space for institutionalization of rights for marginalized groups? No, it also opens a space for the status quo to establish their status quo. For example, one of the most controversial thing in Constitution of Nepal was like establishing the status quo group, the dominant Hindu caste group, called as Khas Aryas, as the minority group. Thus, it diluted the whole concept of social inclusion, because it rather like push the inclusive movement for social inclusion of indigenous and minority by bringing in the same dominant group against whom all this social movements were protesting against, and bringing them as another group in these policies, as the inclusive policies, and that would translate in numerous inclusive policies like legal documents or different commissions that trickles down from constitution to other legal processes, and this was this was a massive, like one of the most controversial thing that happened in the constitution making process, and the question for our civil society groups or the indigenous movement is how does that affect us if we want to talk about building an eco-social contract? Does that contribute towards building conflict or cohesion? Does the legal processes always give opportunity for marginalized group as they claim to establish the right? My argument from the experience of the process of Nepal looking back is no. But who plays the key role despite the setbacks and all this conflict? There comes in civil society between the government and the general public. Civil society plays a key role in keeping the governments accountable, tracking all these processes, and bringing what the public says to these policy making processes. And in another different perspective, what I would like to, I would like to touch more upon ecological reforms, because as I mentioned earlier, it is not always the political movement, political party who have been, no matter if they are elected from the indigenous groups or representatives of Dalit communities or representatives of women and Muslim communities. When it comes to party politics, there is a huge challenge of co-optation of the representatives, of political representatives coming from the minority groups and losing their political agenda, and rather becoming the victim of party politics and adopting to the rules and ideology of major political parties whose leader oftentimes in Nepal comes from very dominant Hindu caste or are male. And the agenda of women or Dalit or Muslims or indigenous peoples are oftentimes dismissed or are not on the negotiation table. And where do these movements go? What are the strategy of these movements when it is not the political movement always giving them the space? So civil society movements are resilient, they are creative, and they are currently seeking spaces from environmental movement, from climate change movement, the growing environmental movement. So this is why the ecological reforms are important to establish the rights of minority and the rights of indigenous people, because they bring in the issues of these minority groups through different arena and spaces. For example, to give example of Nepal, the community forestry program of Nepal is highly widely recognized and held a successful environmental conservation program in terms of conserving forest areas. It has, since its conception in 1990s, it has mobilized almost 1.6 million people, and more than 16% of total forest areas of Nepal are protected. However, the indigenous peoples criticize its limitations, saying although the concept of forestry and conservation is based on indigenous worldviews and practice, but they are not recognized in the formalization and institutionalization processes. Despite this limitation, indigenous peoples are more and more engaging in environmental movements in different ways to establish their rights, because they are tired of all these political movements and co-optation of the agenda by the political leaders. If we look at back the history since 2006 to 2017 or 2015, and one of the example is in 2020, indigenous movement of Nepal won a case against European Development Bank against building high voltage electric power transmission line. So when we are talking about eco-social contract in terms of current global economic model, so this is one of the examples of how indigenous peoples or social movement of minority can challenge the current economic model. who are like rather contributing to not only the climate crisis but global economic crisis as well. So they are using this kind of environmental movement to fight against multilateral development banks and their developmental agenda, which are based on the current neoliberal economic model. I'm bringing in this topic because we are today discussing about the new eco-social contract in times of crisis, and the climate crisis and economic crisis as recognized as one of the biggest crises. That's why we are moving into eco-social contract. One of the small evidence from developing country like Nepal and their fight and the fight of indigenous people could be an example and evidence for the global level as well. So in addition to the role of civil society movements in co-creating an eco-social contract, there is growing women's movement, and Dalit rights movements are growing as well. Women's movement are becoming more stronger in terms of fight against the sexual harassment case, the Me Too movement, the violence against all forms of violence against women. Before they were dismissed like there is no proper stronger evidence, but now there are cases of national level, national celebrities and sports personalities taken to the court and taken to custody for violence against women and rape cases. And there is growing and stronger LGBTIQ movement in Nepal. The new constitution recognizes their rights, by, for example, they can acquire citizenship of Nepal based on their gender identity, which was not possible before. And so this is some of the examples of how marginalized groups are using the policy-making spaces or constitution-making spaces and have used to secure their rights. These are some of the key evidences. To end, I would like to end with a more broader concluding framework. This will only be sustainable both at national and global level if we are talking about the eco-social contract, an economic model that prioritizes human rights, like human rights-based economy. Then only it will be possible to see the transformation of economy and society collectively to work towards the planet and policy that works for both people and the planet, and so that the fight of marginalized groups, indigenous movement at the national level, at the community level, becomes much stronger. And what they have been advocating for would be translated for the change in global level if the eco-social contract, concept of eco-social contract or the vision of eco-social contract can also are based on this more broader vision of how to transfer our economy so that the human rights of everyone is protected and is based on human rights. Thank you. I will end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alina, and also to Pedro. There's so much you want to tell us, and there's so much information, and I want to thank you both for sharing your country stories. Maybe we have room for one question, if there is, immediately from the audience here. If not, then maybe I can take one question that was also posted online. We have a few more, but I would like to pick out one. And that was specifically aimed at Pedro. And Madeleine van Mansveld asked you, Pedro, how can you deal with the forceful entrance of fake news in the dialogues, and especially in a Southern American context, which you also addressed in your presentation? Could you briefly reflect on that, if you can?
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, well, I think the question is in a context where a couple of weeks ago, what everyone probably saw in Brazil, it's an example of what fake news can produce, and in the special situation of the constitutional discussion in Chile, the measures that were taken, I think, quite late, were basically go to the streets, making political campaign, explaining the constitution, and like person to person. I think it is, and there were some initiatives from the government to neutralize fake news, but they were not effective as they should, because basically it's something that it's very difficult to control in WhatsApp groups, and it's also in this borderline of regulation. So basically, if you the discussion, because there was a discussion about fake news and how we can regulate that, but at the same time there are political sectors that saw this as basically limiting the freedom of opinion. And that is a very gray area that it's, and the freedom of expression that it is difficult to move. However, I think something that, and I mentioned in these lessons, something that is, I think it would be useful to have for a future, not only in Chile, but in South America, for future like constitutional discussions, that probably will happen as well in Peru, because they are living quite an exceptional circumstances right now, is focus, make the projects simpler. So to explain themselves to the people. I think that's the best way to approach or to confront fake news, because when we add too much complexity to the discussions and to the rules that we are proposing, basically what we do is to complex the discussions. And when we make the discussion more complex, we restrain the ability of the people to participate and give their own opinions in those discussions. And that is the best, I mean, it's opened the door to fake news and these prophecies of that the far right wing, especially in Chile, was putting on it. So I think that's a good move, and hopefully in this new process in Chile and future ones in South America, that hopefully it will be the approach to take. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your reflections, and thank you, Pedro and Alina, once again for your contributions today. All right, everyone, let's move on to the next presenter, which is going to focus on the EU level, and that is Dharmendra Kanani, who would like to invite also to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and brilliantly pronounced my name. It's amazing. I'm going to be brief, colleague, because I'm so conscious of the fact that you've been listening for quite some time, and there's going to be a tea break, and then I'm back on stage anyway for moderating a session about the renewed social contract. Briefly, I'm Chief Operating Officer at Friends of Europe, and those of you who don't know, we're an independent think tank. We are fiercely independent in the sense that we don't take money from tobacco, arms sales companies, etc., and fossil fuel companies. We're just weeding off. We are not political. We're independent. We're relatively young, 23 years old, and set up because we wanted to do something different in the think tank space. Unfortunately, it was a time of, we didn't have the same kind of movement around gender, but 25 years ago, two guys, one from the FT and one from the European Commission, decided there was a need for something different in the think tank space, and that was far too academic, not focusing on citizens per se, but actually quite an internal bubble type of movement, which is not to criticize other think tanks. We love our brothers and sisters in the field, but what we were trying to do was create a different kind of bridge between policy making and community. So most think tanks see themselves as a bridge between research, analysis, thinking deeply about data, and then providing policy ideas and solutions to government, which is great. What we want to do is affect policy making and decision making. We think that as an independent think tank, that where we can achieve greater impact is if we get into the minds of those who are making decisions, those who are influencing decisions, those who are thinking about making change, and putting them up here on a stage together with you, the private sector and others, to really hunker down on how do you make change happen. So when people are talking about climate adaptation, and you have a civil servant who's thinking, scratching their head and saying, actually, I need to make sure I create a funding mechanism so that communities on the ground can adapt, etc. What they won't have thought about is affordability. What they won't have thought about is the difference between ethnic minority communities, women and those who are disabled, and their ability to adapt based on their income, based on their language, based on their social comfortability. And what we try and do is open up that space, and so make you think differently about how you make change happen. So whether that's to do with climate adaptation, or whether that's to do with strategies in relation to poverty alleviation, or whether we're talking about how we make sure that digitalization in Europe is something which is a force for good rather than a force for bad, what we try and do is bring the tech company together with the academic, potentially with research, with a community and other public sectors, and we create challenge on stage, in debate, and through written output. And so what we're hoping to do is, I suppose the best way of describing it is taking a whole of society, whole of economy approach. So what we try to do is mirror what we want from the world, which is to join up the dots. Because often the way in which, post-World War II government and governance has been established is it's been established in very big silos. You have education locally, you have health, you have, etc., employment. And what we think is we need something which is more porous. We need something which is more joined up and holistic in approach, so that you don't, people, you and I, don't make up our lives in relation to consuming a health service or consuming social services or the kind of access to housing. We are whole, we are holistic. So we need to be thinking about what are the things and the impressions and the impact that it has on us and community, to really think differently about how policy works. So that's what we're about, very briefly. Another couple of minutes on the social contract. So I'd urge you, those of you who I think my colleague has valiantly failed to bring to your attention, I'm going to criticize him behind there. There's these two documents, okay? You can download them. There is a QR code, and both very dear to our heart. This one was our first, around about 2018. And what we tried to do in #EuropeMatters was to try and see how can a think tank, which is obviously seen as being, above there, academic and not in touch, have an impact on the thinking of what I've described before. And so what we tried to do was that it was before this current mandate, and we wanted to kind of make people sit up and think and use data differently. So we brought 4 foresight experts together, and we got them to map out what the future of Europe looks like in 10 years' time. What are the trends? Climate, digital, geopolitical, etc., and say, what is it going to look like in 10 years' time? And then we said, okay, let's think deeply about the role Europe might play. So if Europe was going to be a value setter, what kind of decisions does it have to make against those scenarios? Does it want to be a balancer? Does it want to be just a market maker? So we've tried to, in here, really kind of hold the mirror up to decision makers and say, look, this is where the world's going, and this is the kind of role you could adopt. It's up to you. So that was our baseline, if you like. And then what we did was we created this, which was Vision for Europe. So basically, this was multi-level. So we surveyed Europeans across Europe, so something like 12,000 folk, to ask them, do you believe in the Commission? Yes or no? Do you think it makes a difference to your life? Yes or no? What are the 3 things that are important to you in your life? What are the absolute 3 things that are important to your life? Just to get to the heart of what citizens were feeling. So I conducted interviews privately with 30 big people in private, politicians, etc., just to find out, in a private space, if you could make change happen, or learning from where you've been, what would you change? And in the comfort of privacy, they're able to share with me things that you and I take for granted, to say, actually, we are putting too much red tape. We do need to put a brake on how much policy and regulation we're putting out there. We do need to join the dots up. We do need to think about the politics differently. And oh God, I wish the politicians wouldn't interfere so much. All the usual stuff. And we then also surveyed policymakers, and then we created workshops for over a year. And then at the end, we brought together 3 figures, experts in the field of security, climate, and economics, and asked them to think differently, use the data we'd put together, and said, come up with 3 policy choices for the new Commission. What would they be? If you were able to fly a kite, what would they be? And they brought them together, then we basically reviewed them. So each of these recommendations were then reviewed by their peers, 30 to 50 peer reviewers, and then that was it. We came up with this. This not only deals with what the policy and what the European Commission and Parliament should do, but it's about how as well. So there's fundamentally underpinning this, the how is about co-production, power sharing, and equality and human rights. So I'm going to end on this note in the sense that, this session's about what are the examples of a social contract in the world. And my colleagues, you're breathtaking in what you've done, and it's great to have gone from the local upwards and to the national. It's really wonderful. But we put this frame together in this report, Vision for Europe, because what we felt was actually it's a house of cards. It's a house of cards, a social contract, and some of these things have to work. And if you think about it at the bottom, some of the how is about power sharing. It's actually about making sure you've got more focused accountability. Think about governance differently. Why do you need so many vice presidents, for example? Why can you not cluster vice presidents differently? So actually, rather than have silos, you have more horizontal thinking. Some of that's come through in the Ursula von der Leyen Commission. And we've thought about, making sure that how do you bring strength through diversity? How do you make more women more involved in the discussion? Neuroscience tells us very clearly, the more women you have in a room, the more the difference you're going to have in terms of risk appetite, nuancing things, and thinking about problems differently. They won't think and act. They're going to think, review, and actually reflect. And that's that's not to do with social engineering. That's the way it is because of our social conditioning. So, have a look at that. But what we've said is that it's really important for us. Citizens said to us through our survey that money, i.e. their livelihoods, climate action and climate change, and security were their top 3 concerns. I don't think that's going to change. We're going to go through a similar process. So we're going to, end of this year, produce a set of policy choices in the same way that we did for this one, and welcome all of you to join the journey, and hopefully you can be a part of it. But the one thing I'd give you, and perhaps we don't reflect on enough, when we think about examples of a social contract, the European project in and of itself is the biggest and most successful example of a social contract. We don't think about it. So when you think about the Treaty of Rome, 1957, equal pay of men and women was written into and enshrined in the Treaty of Rome for the first time. And it sounds shocking that it happened in 1957, but hey, there we are in terms of progress of gender equality. But also when you think about the Lisbon Treaty, in terms of the social pillar, what's written in there is fascinating, breathtaking, and foresightful. There's no such word, I know, but it was full of looking at what we can do. And the opportunities both those treaties represent are vast and deep. The only people that get in the way are politicians, and mostly male politicians. This is not a kind of agenda thing, but the reality is we've changed things. But the thing that will actually disintegrate any social contract model are the actions of lack of accountability and corruption that actually shoot across our societies and our emotions and giving us an inability to trust. So sadly, in December, 5 people, a vice president of the European Parliament, someone involved in the TUC, trade unions, and someone who was involved in impunity, trying to think about more accountability. The actors that you want to trust let us down phenomenally. And that's what we need to constantly think about, is that we can do, and it's what my colleagues were saying about Nepal or Chile, governance matters in this. Governance, accountability, and transparency matters. And I think the more we create the mechanisms for accountability the better it will be. It is shocking that MEPs have impunity, and you have to go through so much action to find them being caught red-handed. What is it about our mindset constitutionally in our governance in the EU that politicians can get away with anything, but they have to be caught red-handed if you want to press criminal charges? Is that what was intended by the European Parliament and with the founding fathers? No, I don't think so. I think that we need to really think about this project, and I'm so pleased, Patrick, that you've brought us together. I think we need to rethink a lot of our models of governance and political accountability. I think it's possible. I don't think it's just about Chile and Nepal. It's possible here. We've seen some of the most robust actions of transparency and accountability led by women. When you think about Belarus, when you think about the women of Ukraine, when you think about what's happening in the east of Europe, and the rise of charismatic, more sort of open leaders have been women. So hopefully this century will be more about the activism of equality and women leaders that may lead to a different and better outcome. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Dharmendra. And it was packed full of, I think, insightful comments and also teasers. So I very much look forward to the roundtable discussion that will take place soon. But last but not least, within this round, we also have from a UN level, Isabel Kempf.
Thank you so much, and I'm very pleased to be here. We are based in Bonn, and I'm here with my team, Said and Paramita, and thanks so much to Patrick and the others for inviting us. I would like to start, before I go into the details of this new global action and research network, I want to share with you an experience. Was probably one of my most demanding ever assignments. I was playing Angela Merkel in a socio-drama. And I don't know whether you know what socio-drama is, but it's basically a big group of people like us here. We're like 100 of us. And it's to show the systemic, how a system actually forces you to do certain things or facilitates you doing certain things. So I was Angela Merkel in the migration crisis. So it was around 2 years after the migration crisis had actually happened. And I had to deal with, migrants sleeping at the station, had to go to some Greek island to visit migration camps, had to deal with right-wing politicians being on my back, etc. And what I noticed in that situation is that I had very little time to explain very complex kind of systems and structures, and that I had really had to make sure that I had very simple messages, but that would speak to many people at the same time. And I think what Petro said about the problem or the rejection or the backlash of the Chilean constitution really kind of shows how important concepts are and how it's important that people understand and own concepts. Because in the Chilean case, concepts like right of nature, plurinationalism, for example, were things that really kind of were used in fake news and by the backlash to really confuse people and make people afraid that, what would happen if they voted in favor of the constitution. So a little bit, the network is, apart from many other things, is a little bit about that. Clarifying concepts, sharing concepts, and creating ownership. Next, please. Oh, Patrick has disappeared. Okay, thanks. We have talked all day already about the multiple crises that we are facing, the ecological crisis, questions of rising inequality, and then, of course, the question of climate change, planetary boundaries, and how we kind of need to face this crisis that is complex and that's built in within the system. Next one, please. And our flagship publication that Paul already mentioned this morning came out in October, and it's really a very much in-depth analysis of the different dimensions of inequality, how are they linked to current trends. So we're talking about inequality related to climate, to power asymmetries, of course, social and economic inequalities, and then kind of try to come up with ideas, how can we overcome or reduce inequalities through a new eco-social contract. Next one, please. So you're highly, of course, hopefully all motivated to read that. And then, of course, we also have been talking today about global trends, globalization, technology. And the other day in a dinner conversation in a bar, I asked one of my artificial intelligence friends, where do you see the biggest threat of artificial intelligence on society? And his first answer was, again, fake news. That you can create kind of, any kind of reality and sell it as reality, and that it will be very difficult to kind of make the distinction in the future between reality and what's presented on social media, on television, etc. The other trends, can you go back, please? Yeah, the other ones we know, of course, intergenerational justice and equality, the question of migrations. Do migrants have the same rights as other citizens, for example, or not? Urbanization and, of course, shifting global powers and also the relationship between different regions in the world and also within countries. So in response to these multiple crises and these challenges, UNRWA, together with its network, has been thinking about a few of the dimensions that a new eco-social contract should contain. And I'm sure Patrick, who is also part of the network, will present us this afternoon his book and his thinking about this. But within the network, we have come up with this kind of 7 principles or dimensions which we think should be included in new eco-social contracts. And one, of course, is the human rights for all, because some of parts of society, such as migrants or minorities, etc., don't have the same rights yet as citizens. Then progressive fiscal contracts. We have to make sure that inequality is reduced, but that costs money. It's not for free. Equality is also something that's not given and not for free. So how can we redistribute to make sure that societies are just and fair? Transform economies and societies through kind of more sustainable lifestyles, consumption and production. A contract for nature, so we wait for Patrick to explain this to us this afternoon. And that was also, of course, part of the Chilean constitution. What does it mean, the rights of nature? How can you legalize those, and what does it really mean for the way we envision society? Then addressing historical injustices, I think in discussions about systemic racism and discrimination, we have to talk about historical injustices and not just, leave them in the past, but really address them and discuss them. Then the question of gender justice and rights of different, sexual minorities. And last but not least, the solidarity, because often in liberal societies, it's always us against them. Different lobbying groups, also in the European Commission, doing their advocacy, their lobbying for their issues, and the more powerful you are, the more likely it is that your issues are being taken up. Whereas we really want to show that, it's us all together against corona or against climate change, because there is no we or us in front of a very kind of life-changing climate situation. And then, next one, please. Yeah, so then together with Oliver, whom I've been knowing for a long time because I used to work on green economy transition as well, we had this discussion like 2 years ago, no, Oliver? And we always felt that, the green economy movements often were really lacking the social dimension and the equality dimension. There is a just transition concept, but it was in the beginning very much pushed by the trade unions, but not really in the consciousness of the rest of society. And then sustainable lifestyles were very much about individual choices and not collective choices. So we really thought it's very important to push and advocate for these kind of collective concepts and of this collective vision of where do we want to go as a society. So that's the idea of the eco-social contract. Then we had a lot of discussions about should it be eco-social or only social contract, because a lot of the other partners like McKinsey, UN Secretary General, they all talk about a new social contract, but we think from the UNRWA side, at least, that it's very important to talk about the ecological and social contract, because we left nature out in the previous social contracts. And then also Oliver made a very important point, because we wanted to, in the beginning we discussed, should it be eco-social transformation or should it be contract? And then Oliver really insisted on the legal aspects, because you can have all kind of nice wishful thinking about your transformations, and I think it's a very wishy-washy concept. For me, transformation can be anything, but a contract really has legal implications. And I think all of us who have worked on environmental change, we all know it's not enough to have individual behavioral change. You need regulations, you need legislations to really make a long-term change. And market mechanisms have not reduced CO2 emissions. I think the last year was one of the highest CO2 emissions in history, and it's always the last year. I mean, whenever we talk, it's always the year before that has the highest emissions. So emissions have not gone down because of market mechanisms. They don't work. So we really need to talk about regulations, and regulations have to be part of new eco-social contracts because they have to be agreed by everyone in society. So that's why we're using this term eco-social contract, just to explain a little bit. And then the network was launched in 2021. Next one, please. And the idea is to foster dialogue between researchers, policymakers, and social movements. And at the moment, we have over 200 members already after like a year, a little bit more than a year. And also there are a lot of kind of blogs and thematic issues, and I'm sure Patrick will launch a bit later on in the roundtable the thematic issues that he wrote together with Najma, a little bit on why do we need kind of new concept and challenge the existing economic system, but he will talk about it. Oh yeah, Najma will do that, yeah. So next one, please. The network decided to work in the form of different working groups. So we have one on historical and intergenerational injustices, and you've seen Alina, who just talked about the case of Nepal. She has written a paper about that experience of Nepal that was discussed and then further elaborated in the working group. There's one on human rights and gender, where we also talk a lot about resource rights, access rights to natural resources. Then one on contact with nature, and then on transforming economies and societies. And all of them are working on research papers, but also on kind of roundtables, on kind of bringing these issues into different specific contexts. And Pedro also, who's also can have been invited by the network to talk about the Chilean experience. I think that's a really important example on how we can help each other to learn from different processes. So Chile can learn from Nepal. I mean, as you've seen, there are a lot of similar kind of topics. And also how the ecological movements are now becoming very important. I think for a long time it was more the social movements, but now I think the ecological movements are taking on the social issues as well and the human rights issues, because they see that they're very much linked, so that you need to advance both at the same time. So I think for constitution making at the moment, I think ecological actors, and Pedro himself, he's working for an ecological basically movement, are becoming really, really important actors as well. The next one, please. Yeah, so here's just a kind of a few of our publications, and we brought also, this is a series that we have, on thematic issues on a new eco-social contract. So we brought a few here if you're interested to read it. But you can also contribute to our blog, where we have a lot of different intellectuals, writers, policymakers, also migrants from different parts of the world who are writing and trying to help us to further advance and discuss the concept. And also, of course, one of the real aims of the network is to exchange best practice or good practices, experiences, and try to kind of build a critical mass of people to show or to push decision makers that they're to create spaces to discuss new eco-social contracts. May they be at local level, national level, or international level. And I think a good example for a new eco-social contract at international level is the discussion about business, a treaty for business and human rights and international supply chains. Because there are a lot of ecological and human rights issues, linked to supply chains, and the idea is here a little bit, how can we make sure that different voices are heard in that also legal discussion. Good, next one, please. Yeah, that's just a few of the events. Next. And then that's an invitation to all of you to join the network, become a part of it. As I said, it's a very lively and vibrant network. And our team, Kumi Naidus, has also been one of our very first champions of the network. His dream was to really have, a lot of young people and researchers from around the world come up with visions, also what Nikki and the other colleagues here have brought forward with ideas and very concrete action also. And the idea is to bring research and action together. So you're really welcome to join us. Thanks.
All right. Also, thank you so much for presenting. I hope you agree with me that we've gained some valuable insights from all of the presenters we just heard. Before we move on, of course, we went a little bit over time, and apologies for that. But let us stretch our legs a bit, get a cup of coffee and a tea, and we propose that within a few minutes we get back and start with the roundtable on transformative change. Thank you.